In a move seen as an escalation by the West, Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced a partial military mobilization in Russia. In a televised address to the nation, he said that 300,000 reservists will now be called up to fight in Ukraine to, quote, ensure Russian territorial integrity. Well, it comes as Russian-backed officials say that they plan to hold so-called referenda in Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia from Friday. US, Germany and France have said that they'd never recognise the results of what they've called sham ballots. Well, with me now is Peter Dickinson, Ukraine editor at the Atlantic Council, joining us from Kyiv. Peter, great to have you with us once again. How will Ukraine be reacting to Putin's address?
Well, Ukraine itself has been quite clear that it will pay very little attention, essentially, to Ukraine, to Putin's address. They regard it as a bluff. They regard it as a sign of recognition, rare public recognition, that Russia is losing the war. And they see it as more of the same, really. They've heard this sort of rhetoric before. They've heard threats before along the lines of what we've heard today. And the referendums are regarded as illegitimate and a sign that Russia is looking to freeze the conflict because it sees the way the wind is blowing, so to speak. It sees that it is losing, Ukraine is advancing, and Putin is desperate.
Even if the ballots are viewed as illegitimate by Ukraine and by nations such as France, the UK, the US and Germany, nevertheless, how important is it that they are happening from Friday in conjunction with this announcement from Putin?
Putin is going to stage these referendums. Of course, they will be passed by large majorities. The assumption is the results are already decided. And then very quickly, perhaps immediately, Putin will declare that these parts of Ukraine rather, are now parts of the Russian Federation. Now, that does change the calculus, because then Ukraine's continued offensive actions, Ukraine's attempts to liberate its own territory, will be labelled by Russia as attacks on the Russian Federation. And that then brings into play, potentially, the nuclear question. Russia's military doctrine specifically states that attacks on the use of nuclear weapons is only admissible if the Russian Federation's existence and territorial integrity is under threat. Now, clearly, that is what Putin is very unsubtly hinting at. He is saying, if you continue your offensives, once I've claimed this territory, I may use nuclear weapons.
How is Ukraine reacting to Vladimir Putin's address and his plans for what he calls a partial mobilisation of the military? What does it mean for the current situation on the ground in Ukraine as 4 regions face referenda held on them joining Russia from Friday in ballots which the West have described as a sham? Well, to discuss all of this now, I'm joined by our correspondent, Sasha Vakulina. Sasha, firstly, what has the reaction been in Ukraine to the announcement from Vladimir Putin?
The reaction was, this does not change things much for Ukraine. Of course, Putin's address was to his nation. That was the address to the Russians to announce this, as he says, partial mobilization, but also to justify, to explain why he says Russians will be mobilized now, talking again about the nuclear threats from the West, talking about the West threatening Russia or what is happening in Ukraine. But for Ukrainians, and this is something we have heard today from the authorities and the officials in Ukraine, this was a rather predictable step, but it doesn't change much what is happening in Ukraine. This is seen in Ukraine as a reaction of Vladimir Putin and his authorities to the efficient and successful counteroffensive in the northeast of Ukraine, and specifically is what happened with the withdrawal of Russian troops in Kharkiv, but that doesn't change much on the ground.
Well, talking about the situation on the ground, as you say, we've seen Ukraine retake a good deal of territory there in the northeast. What would more troops coming in mean for the battle? What is the situation right now?
Well, it also depends on how quickly they can join the battle, how quickly they can be on the ground, how well trained they will be, and how ready for that fighting they will be. Because now we're talking about Ukrainian counteroffensive moving slowly to the east, from northeast, from Kharkiv, going towards Luhansk. There's massive fighting now happening over the town of Liman, and this is really heavy fighting. How prepared would be the newly mobilized Russian troops for that one? Also, the counteroffensive still continues in the south of Ukraine. This is the region of Kherson. So again, Ukraine's strategy, its tactics, its situation on the ground hasn't changed. The counteroffensive in Ukraine continues by the troops in multiple directions.